back to Secret Weapons, and we're here today to talk about two pedals from Pettyjohn Electronics, the Edge and the Lift Mark II. So I first met the Pettyjohn crew at the last Summer NAMM before the end of the world. They had a simple little setup at the Summer NAMM show floor, off to the side, shared with a couple other brands, and they just had a board with all of their drives on it. And I remember sitting down and plugging in and turning on the Iron Mark II, which is kind of like their Fender in a box, and being immediately impressed. All their stuff just was built so well. The sound quality in them was so top notch. I really was impressed with the build quality. So when they reached out and asked if I would like to check out these two, I immediately knew that I would be excited. I knew I liked their build quality. I knew I liked the sound of everything I had tried from them. But I'll admit that I said yes with a little bit of trepidation. Their drives always struck me as the kind of thing that was meant to interact with tubes really effectively. There's some drives that just don't gel well with digital amps and amp modeling software, and I use a lot of that. The intro piece on this, as with a lot of stuff, was recorded all with the Walrus Audio ACS1 amp cab sim. I do a lot of stuff with the Iridium as well. Even when I'm using a real amp, very frequently, tube amps that I do use, single-ended tube amps like the Supro 1605, the Benson Vinny, and the Milkman Amp 100, they are all, while being tube amps, they all eventually get run, from my tastes, to a cab sim of some kind, some sort of IR loader or cab filter. So, and even in those situations, sometimes it just doesn't sit right if you're using a drive pedal that is kind of intended to play nice with tubes. And if you read the description of pedals like the Edge, it really screams, this is for your tube amp. This pedal is meant to push the right harmonic information into a tube amp, right at that edge of breakup, to push it into that kind of really sweet spot of saturation. But I decided, whatever, let's give it a chance. If they want me to do a video on it, I need it to work in the kind of setup that I use, that I think a lot of people who follow this channel probably use as well, to find out if it's right for them. So for this entire video, we're using no tube amps. We're doing everything into amp modeling for both the Edge and the Lift Mark II. And I gotta say, I'm really impressed for the kind of warm, wide, harmonic drive and distortion that these pedals produce. It sits really well in an amp modeling environment. It responds really well to a compressor before it and a cab and amp sim after it. It really just kind of felt very natural from my play style, which is really exciting because I'm probably pickier about drives than I am anything else, despite them not being traditionally the center point of what I'm working on. So let's start by talking about the Edge a little bit, because it's a little bit more straightforward. The Edge, like I said, is kind of meant to be an edge of breakup kind of thing. It's the device that adds that little bit of harmonic character to your guitar that pushes your tube amp into overdrive. Meant to do it in kind of that perfect magical way. But even with an amp setup like I'm using here, it still manages to open up really effectively a Fender style amp in an amp sim. We did a little bit with an AC30 style amp at the end there with one of the Strat tracks, but largely for this we have been and will be using Fender style amps because that's 99% of what I record with. But the thing that surprised me is I was kind of expecting to push the level really hard, ride the drive back pretty aggressively. I kept the drive pretty high almost the whole way through on this thing, only really dialing back my highs and lows to kind of avoid boominess on the low end or too much shrillness if I'm really pushing that drive. But I found that it sat really sweetly in the mix at almost all times. I will say this has the orange mod in it, which is an orange LED. It's kind of their vintage version of this pedal with lower headroom, a little bit more of a vintage warm sound, a little less clarity, a lot less headroom, although I am running this at 18 volts, which I really found helped kind of raise it back up a little bit. I could see the orange mod being really great if you're running into a cranked Supro or something and you want to run it at 9 just so that everything sounds gritty and small and tight in that way. That's really exciting if you're playing kind of some throwback rock kind of stuff. But for me, I want that warmth and that vintage thing, but in a modern context. And I think that the orange mod on this in 18 volts really kind of bridges that gap effectively, especially having it after the Lift, which is what we're going to talk about now. The Lift Mark II is essentially here to, like the name implies, lift your tone. The Lift Mark II in its bypassed state is actually an always on, super high quality buffer that really just kind of brings your tone back to where you want it to be. It's not the kind of thing that you're gonna like realize is there when it's on all the time. But like if you take it out of the chain with a bunch of long cable runs, you will notice some sparkle goes out of your guitar. Some definition in the mid-range and the low end kind of softens back up a little bit, where with something like this, you get all that information. It sounds great. And even better, this thing has a great preamp drive in it. The level and boost on this thing, once again, very similar to the Edge, can be pushed very, very hard. It will put out a lot of volume, but very cleanly and in ways that I find to be very responsive and reactive to your playing dynamics, as well as with how you hit the amp at the end of the chain, be it tube or digital. My Lift Mark II actually has something called the Soviet mod, which is a mod you can have done by Pettyjohn when you buy one of these that replaces the kind of standard Germanium diodes in this thing with a set of like pre-Soviet 70s new old stock Germanium diodes that kind of add a little bit more mid-range character, give a little bit of a mid-push when you've got the boost engaged, and I gotta say, it sounds really good. It doesn't really remind me of like a Tube Screamer or an ODR1. It really does feel like it's its own thing, pushing its own version of kind of like a mid-range sweetener. So yeah, if I had to describe either or both of these, it would be warm and crunchy where you need it to be and smooth where you need it to be, but uniquely different from one to the other, and they actually stack really well. So let's go to kind of our like top-down pedalboard view. I will show you how I like these set, how they stack together, and how they kind of favor one over the other for certain applications. So let's dig in. So I think that going into this part of the video, I think it's important to kind of acknowledge that I don't typically review a lot of drives and demo a lot of drives because I don't think that I am an authority on this issue. I don't think that I'm going to be kind of like the ultimate voice on all the sounds you can get from a drive pedal. I'm very much I find one or two sounds in there that I really love, and I stick with those. And so I want to kind of highlight some of those things instead of this being a really feature-rich deep dive right now. We're going to go through some things I like about the Lift and the Edge, some specific kind of things that I lean towards very frequently, and how they play with the compressor that I use, the Cali 76 in this case. So let's run through the pedal board right now as it stands so that we know what we're looking at before we jump in. Going into Origin Effects Cali 76 compressor, the Pettyjohn Lift Mark II, and Edge, into the Walrus Audio Polychrome flanger. At that point, we are going into the Microcosm, the Volante, the Flint, the Mercury 7, and the ACS-1 set as a Fender amp. Right now we have just the Flint, the Volante, and the compressor on. We might turn some other stuff on later, but for now we're going to stick with a dotted eighth on the Volante and a plate reverb on the Strymon Flint. Let's hear how that sounds. So let's start things off with the Lift Mark II at kind of a really, really high boost setting that I really enjoy. We're cutting some lows for clarity. We are boosting a little bit of treble, but you'll notice a lot of like kind of like harmonic content in this drive setting. So. So let's kind of add some other stuff to that signal and see kind of how that drive tone can really accentuate a more ambient piece. So we're going to turn that off. We're going to kind of dial in some bigger, washier stuff with a little bit more movement, and then we'll bring that lift back in. And for some context, let's see how those exact same knob settings react on the Edge. We'll dial back some of this ambience for a second. So let's gain that up so that we're kind of hitting similar distortion levels, but keeping the EQ settings the same so you kind of hear how they sit differently. So you can hear what I was talking about earlier in terms of like harmonic content, in terms of the way that the distortion and the drive plays with the individual notes you're playing, really, really distinctly versus individual notes being played. Okay, in this this out of phase thing, let's crank the lows a little bit more on this. So for context, this is without the compressor on. This Mustang's pretty low output.